COVID. So we record all of the events through the Bolinga Black Cultural Resources Center for students, faculty, staff, alumni, friends of the university who are unable to attend. We record it and then we post it on our YouTube page so that's easily accessible for folks down the line. But thank you all for joining us here today as part of this week-long celebration of MLK Week. Of course, MLK Week takes place on January 17th of this year, so this coming Monday. If you are going to be attending, it's a virtual celebration here at Wright State University, so we are trying to do our best to prevent the spread of COVID with the Omicron variant now catching more and more steam. So as always, we like to recommend for folks, we're not telling folks, but we like to recommend for folks to continue to get vaccinated, getting boosted. Always wear your mask when you're in public and always wear the appropriate mask. Nothing that's breathable. If you can feel your hand in front of your face and you can breathe on it, that means that is not a good mask. So we like to recommend for folks to wear your mask and take all of the safety precautions to prevent the spread of COVID. So again, thank you all for joining us here today in this virtual format. I wanted to put together this presentation, or at least a conversation, on a lot of Dr. King's work, at least as it surrounds the concept of peace. A lot of folks know or are aware of Dr. King's work when it comes to activism, as well as organizing, and especially around racial justice, economic justice. But a lot of times we only keep it within the frame of essentially like civil rights. But a lot of people don't necessarily take it and look at it from a more broader perspective and recognize that Dr. King was one of the most important figures in world history, but let alone American history as well, especially when as it relates to being able to realize peace essentially in America, but also globally as well, and bringing awareness to injustice around the world. So I wanted to take the time to at least take some of the works that I've been able to read through, look at with Dr. King's work, and then being able to apply a lot of those concepts to the concept of peace and justice in and of itself. And I know the title may be like a little bit misleading because it says like peace as the end in justice, like peace as ending justice. But essentially, the end is like ultimately the philosophical question. Do the means justify the ends, or does the end justify the means? At the end of the day, it's the end. So at the end of the day, the end goal is always justice, which there cannot be justice if there is no peace within society. And hopefully those are some things that are communicated throughout this presentation in and of itself. So getting to our first question, essentially, what is justice? So justice is the highest level of political moral virtue by which legal, political, and social conditions can be collectively measured. So essentially, it's not necessarily looking at it in terms of this is ultimately what justice is, but being able to identify what justice does not look like. So if you can look at political structures, if you can look at these social structures, our legal structures, and then we can identify the immoralities that are essentially taking place, then we can identify that there's injustice that is taking place. So justice not only refers to the distribution, because ultimately we see a lot of conversations around justice relating to power, but justice not only refers to the distribution of power, but the institutional conditions necessary for the development and exercise of individual capacities, as well as collective communication and cooperation. So essentially, when we're talking about and when we're looking at justice within societies, within structures, we're looking at the ability for all individuals within those spaces, whether it be political, social, educational, to be able to, one, participate as much as they humanly can without the restrictions of other people or other people imposing restrictions on those other individuals. It's also being able to have voice within those structures as well. And then, of course, achieving justice requires eliminating institutional forms of oppression which may exist, which ultimately lead folks to not being able to participate fully within any given society or structure. And I do apologize because you'll hear like some of these dings and stuff from like emails and all of that. It's either me letting people into the room or I'm just receiving some emails. So what is peace in and of itself? I'm going to keep it pretty simple because my Dr. Snowart, who's my chair of my dissertation, he could go on and on about what peace is, but we're going to look at really more succinct definition of like what peace is in two categories. I guess you can look at it from a binary. So there's negative peace and then there's positive peace. Negative peace is essentially the absence of war, physical violence, or anything that imposes physically on other human beings or other communities as well. So essentially, negative, absence of the physical forms of violence being imposed on other individuals or groups as well. Then there's the positive piece. This is where Dr. Snowart comes in, where he says it's the realization of the complete range of human rights, civil, political, economic, cultural, and social, as well as freedom from aggression. So not only in society or in the world do we need to have negative peace in terms of not going around clearly, killing other people, inflicting violence on other groups of folks, but also then what are we doing on the flip side of that, which is realizing how are we creating spaces where human rights are realized, are actualized? How are we creating these civil political spaces where democracy is in full effect, where all people are also being able to participate and have voice in those spaces as well? So essentially, at the end of the day, it's about recognizing that if to have peace, then there needs to be the elimination of oppression within society. And that requires being able to identify what oppression necessarily looks like. So with oppression, it's not necessarily to say this is the concrete definition of what it is, but Iris Young, she wrote a great article which is titled "The Five Faces of Oppression," where she introduces what these five aspects or these components look like typically. So one is exploitation. Exploitation is the steady process of transferring the results of one labor group to benefit another group. So typically one of the first examples that we always go to, which rightfully so, is forced labor within America, or chattel slavery in and of itself. The 1619 Project just came out, which is a great read for folks. Of course, you can also look at some of Ibram X. Kendi's work, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which these two expound greatly into detail on what exploitation looks like through chattel slavery. But there's also other forms of exploitation that typically takes place as well. But it's also the failure to recognize others as persons. So essentially, a lot of oppression revolves around, and you'll see this embedded through all of these five faces, which is it's dehumanizing. It's essentially the practices that we put in place to exploit categories of human beings, which is ultimately dehumanizing those categories of human beings. Then you have marginalization, when people of whole categories are expelled from useful participation in social life, potentially subjected to material deprivation and even extermination. So marginalization, another great definition that I think of, I forget the name of the person, it slips my mind right now, but it's essentially the ways in which we take people and we push them on the margins of society. So it's a dehumanizing act, because essentially what it's saying is that we use people to the purposes in which they are useful to us. So when they are not useful to us, then what do? We push them, we push them on the margins of society. So that is essentially what marginalizing acts look like. Then you have powerlessness, the inability to display one's capacity to their fullest, lack of decision-making power, exposure to disrespectful treatment due to their position within society. King goes into great detail about what powerlessness looks like within society, and there are other authors who are also doing great jobs with illuminating these issues as well. One of them being Ibram X. Kendi. But one of the things about powerlessness is not only is it the physical component of that in terms of how we are controlling structures and who we hire into certain positions, what we are hiring folks to do, but it's also the psychological component of that as well, in terms of what consequence does it have on the human mind when groups of people or categories of people are typically positioned in one area socially or politically for so long? What then does it do consequentially to their mind in terms of what is my expectation in society? What is my capacity within society? What is it that I'm ultimately going to be able to do for myself as well as for my family and others? We have cultural imperialism, the process of the dominant group's norms and culture becoming defined as the norm. So it's really the imposing of norms onto folks. One of the first things that I'll typically think of now is when we have, of course, in America, our primary language is American English. But what happens when folks come to America from different countries? The first thing we ask folks to do is to do what? Speak English. It's the ways in which when you go into certain places, how you see language, you see English posted everywhere. In very few spaces do we often see other languages that are there to accommodate folks who don't necessarily speak that language. It's now forcing people to then learn how to speak English. And of course, there's other ways that we impose cultures onto folks, particularly in America, once they get here. Even now, some of the things that we talk about, even at Wright State University or other colleges and universities as well, which is like dress codes and different things like that. What does professionalism look like? And if you don't look professional, then what are the consequences of you not looking professional and things like that? So cultural imperialism is another form of oppression in and of itself, because often what it does is that from a dehumanizing aspect, it strips a person of their culture and who they are, and it forces them to take on another. So it goes back to a lot of what Kendi talks about, which is this forced assimilation and adaptation within society in order to go along, really just to get along. And then, of course, we have violence. So violence is sorry, I didn't read the bottom part of that, but the dominant culture stereotypes and inferiorizes images of the dominant group, and these images must be internalized by the non-dominant group. Of course, that goes into, like I stated before, but that powerlessness piece of it, the psychological consequences of having one culture or one norm forced onto you. And then violence. Violence is avoidable insults and threats to basic human needs and to life, lowering the real level of needs satisfaction below what is potentially possible. So it's not just looking at the physical pieces of that, but the different forms of violence that we inflict on cultures, communities, in society without physically having to put hands on anybody or to kill anyone or anything like that. So again, that last sentence within that is really important. The lowering of real level of need satisfaction below what is potentially possible. One of the things that a lot of different authors talk about now is that one of the great, I forget the name of the speaker, but one of the things that he stated is that a lot of people will die at the age of 25, but then be buried at 75. All that to say is that when you inflict so much forms of violence onto people, and sometimes even with our own selves, people live a long life in which they're not essentially doing anything or achieving anything, largely because they feel as if their lives have been capped at a certain point, which is then another form of violence. So there's different things that have been stated with that as well. Dabrowski, who's a nurse, she actually was able to put forth another really important article that actually bridges off of the 5 faces of oppression, using that in healthcare services. But what she states is that violence gains legitimacy when it is tolerated and unchallenged, and when those who perpetrate the violence are only lightly reprimanded, if at all. So one of the greatest ways that we see this operating within society now is in our court system. And when we see police brutality, when we see Black men, women being murdered, and then there's the hope that they're actually going to go to jail versus knowing that they're going to go to jail, and they're going to go to jail for an adequate amount of time or an adequate number of years. Even now with that recent case with Ahmaud Arbery, how it's such a surprise that 3 men who chased down an individual who's running and jogging through a neighborhood, they, one, are found guilty of it, but then also going to prison for the rest of their lives. The fact that we find ourselves rejoicing for things like that is an identifier, or should signal to people that there's a lot of injustice going on when those are the things that we're now celebrating and just hoping that folks are being reprimanded for the acts of violence that they inflict on other communities of people. Whereas the violence of the oppressors prevents the oppressed from being fully human, the response of the latter to this violence is grounded in the desire to pursue the right to be human. So essentially, this goes to, this is Paulo Freire who's speaking in the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is a really great book, very very thick. But what he's talking about here again goes to the psychological piece of it, and then you have people who are being oppressed. What he states is that oppression, all people in oppressive societies, recognizing that we all live in oppressive societies, we are all oppressed to a certain degree. It just looks differently. So you have people who are oppressed by oppressing other people. They are dehumanizing themselves because they're not realizing the humanity of other people. And then you have the people who have been dehumanized, who haven't had their humanity realized, that are now seeking to become and be identified as more human. And then the acts that they're taking to recognize all of that. And then this last piece, which is few disagree that peace could exist in the absence of a consensus on respect for human rights and the prohibition of violence, which is essentially saying that we can't really we can't realize peace within our society if we have one, these five faces of oppression which continue to exist, and then we see so much affliction and infliction on the human rights and the civil rights of human beings. So before I move forward, does anyone have any questions about any of that, or was any of that unclear? All right. So then getting to Dr. King. So I wanted to take those five faces of oppression and then bring in some excerpts from Dr. King and being able to tie in the ways in which he has addressed those. Because again, even though Iris Young wrote that article in 2014, of course, Dr. King was alive in the mid part of the 20th century, and a lot of his work still carries on today. So it's real interesting to look at how we term certain things now, and then being able to look back on the ways in which he was addressing this work, or he was addressing these efforts, being able to speak to a lot of these things even before it had a name to it or anything like that. So I just think that some of these concepts are pretty cool. So I think I went back, sorry. So in Palm Sunday, which is a sermon on Gandhi, so of course he was away for about 2 months when he ultimately came back, and then he gave this sermon. But one of the things that he said is that Gandhi looked at his people as they lived in ghettos and hovels, and as they lived out on the streets, many of them, and even today, after being exploited so many years, they haven't been able to solve those problems. One of the things that he did within this particular sermon was that he brought to light the fact that exploitation was taking place. It's a global issue. So he's talking to his congregation full of Black people, full of people who are living largely paycheck to paycheck, and some people even below that. And it's almost, in a way, you could see is like kind of preaching to the choir. But he's revealing to even his congregation that there are these levels of exploitation that are taking place globally, not just locally, and being able to identify what these things look like. Even talking about what they were referred to as the untouchables, and being able to recognize what that even feels like, and being able to read on that and hear about that from a person who visited India, but then also coming back to America, and then being able to talk about that as well, and how we, particularly as Black people, the congregation that he was speaking to, often feel like the marginalized, the exploited, the untouchables within the society as well. And this is a really great excerpt that came out of that sermon as well. But he says that, and one day he was taking a train to Pretoria, I believe that's how you pronounce it, and he said, and he had class accommodations on that train. And when they came to pick up the tickets, and this is him talking about Gandhi, and when they came to pick up the tickets and they noticed that he was an Indian, that he had a brown face, and they told him to get out and move on to the third class accommodation, that he wasn't supposed to be there with any first class accommodation. And Gandhi that day refused to move, and they threw him off the train. And there in that cold station that night, he stayed all night, and he started meditating on his plight and the plight of his people. And he decided from that point on that he would never submit himself to injustice or to exploitation. So again, it's being able to take those concepts again that we just talked about, with this being exploitation, and then recognizing this position of powerlessness that Gandhi was essentially thrown into, but then also recognizing that that's not a position that he was going to subject himself, but also his people to any further, which of course you go on and you read about the works of Gandhi and his significance to the world, and you can recognize, how critical he was to the world as well. So, does anyone have any questions about any of that, or being able to connect, why exploitation or how some of those concepts are still prevalent today and what that looks like? My style isn't to just like keep going through, so I like to ask questions and things like that before I move forward.
Quatez. I just want to say, do we see that happening like in the workforce, the exploitation?
um, Trying to answer your question while not throwing myself into into the response to
Right.
it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that certainly takes place. So, I mean, when you go back to like the exploitation in terms of like how we exploit, so the definition being how we exploit the labor of folks, and then use essentially you're using that to the gain of another group of folks. So I think the number one thing that we can always go to is how pay scales are exercised within society. How there's a minimum wage, but then we recognize that a minimum wage is that's a minimum wage, but that doesn't necessarily speak to what the needs are of folks that can live within that society. So now I think the federal minimum wage is like $8 and something an hour, but then you look out into society and the average rent, at least from where we currently live now in the Dayton area, rent can be as low or as high, really, as about
Mhm.
$800 for a one bedroom apartment. So then you're talking about folks who have kids in schools that also have other needs and different things like that. So if we have a minimum wage of $8 an hour, then how is that going to help that person be able to take care of their families? That's a level of exploitation.
Mhm.
Another thing, as well, as when we look at healthcare, stuff like that. So, me myself, I fortunately was able to live through it, but I had my appendix removed a couple of months ago. Um, but that was a $50,000 surgery, and of course, or at least they charge you 50,000. Now, do I
Mhm.
think it actually costs $50,000? I don't necessarily know. It seems like kind of arbitrary, right? That's part of exploitation as
Mhm.
well, where a lot of
Mhm.
things are arbitrarily done. But here I received this $50,000 bill. Now I do have some health insurance to help kind of offset some of that, but it doesn't offset all of that. So,
Mhm.
it's being able. So now I'm thinking about myself and where I am with my ability to help pay for some of that. But again, think about that person who now makes $8 an hour. Now they have to make critical decisions moving forward in terms of now I have to pay these medical bills, but then I also have to pay for my family to live and everything as well. So certainly, yeah,
Mhm.
that falls into all of that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a great question. Any
Uh-huh.
any other questions? All right. So, um, King said, "Oh, yeah, this is the last thing I had on there. Forgot that I put that on there." All right. So King said, "We must be born again." So, and I'm going to talk about this at the end of it as well. But King said one of the ways to defeat exploitation is that we must be born again. And another great book that I would recommend for a lot of folks is "Begin Again," actually by Eddie S. Glaude. Eddie Glaude, he does a lot of his work on the works of James Baldwin, but this concept of being able to begin again. Society should always be not reproducing themselves as is, but reproducing themselves to get better. So you either reproduce yourself in one or two ways. You reproduce yourselves in the ways that continue to inflict violence or oppression, or you reproduce yourselves in ways that transform oppression as well. So what King says here is that societies must be born again. So your whole structure must be changed. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them and then make them things, and therefore they will exploit them and poor people generally, as well as economically. And then being able to even take just race aside from that, exploitation is not just limited to race. So we exploit people who are under resourced, and one of the critiques of Dr. King's work as well is that he doesn't talk about the exploitation of women as well as the exploitation of the LGBTQA community as well. So there's definitely exploitation is not just limited to racialized communities. It extends to these other communities as well, and those are things that we certainly have to take into consideration. So, Dr. King on marginalization. So, in Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, tracing Dr. King's adoption of nonviolent approaches. One of the things he says is to deprive a man of freedom is to relegate him to the status of a thing. So, again, we're going back to thingifying people rather than elevating them to a status of a human being or a person. So, man must never be treated as a means to the end of the state, but always as the end in and of itself. So when we are looking at structures, it's like when we're putting together a strategic plan, working at Wright State. So if we're going to be putting together a strategic plan for the university, the strategic plan should begin and end with the people who are working within that facility as well, not just how are we using people to get to this alternate end that doesn't take into consideration the lived conditions of these people. So it's about being able to not only uplift the structure, but we should also be uplifting the people within that structure as well. Nonviolence and social change. Dr. King delivered 5 lectures for a Massey lecture series. One of the things that he stated in there was that in our society, it is murder psychologically to deprive a man of a job or an income. You are in substance saying that he has no right to exist. You are in a real way depriving him of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and denying, in this case, the very creed of his society. So again, I recognize the operative, man being embedded in that. We just talked about that. Some of the limitations is not being able to speak to just people in general. But what he's getting to hear now is that marginalization, again, isn't just how we economically push people on the margins of society, but psychologically as well. You now, when we create these systems or we put these systems in place, we're now forcing people to adopt this idea that where they are in a certain space is where they belong. And again, some of the things that we talked about within our culture and identity centers, as I gave a presentation on the 5 psychological factors of empowerment, is that people typically will operate in the ways in which they believe their mind is set toward. So again, if I believe that where I am is where my life is capped, then I'm going to continue to operate in that way, versus if I believe that my life is worth more and I deserve more, then I'm clearly going to be operating in that way. Or at least that there's the idea that should be taking place. The other America, what he talked about, Dr. King traveled to traveling the country on behalf of the Poor People's Campaign, which this was something that he engaged in toward the latter end of his life. So when you read his work, he often talks about in his teen years is when he identified that it wasn't just racial oppression that was taking place in America, but there was also a lot of economic oppression, exploitation, and that they were oftentimes intertwinable. So you have white people who were also poor that were oftentimes marginalized and exploited just as much, but in different ways as Black people were as well. So in one of these excerpts from his work, he stated that the problem is America has had a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds on the question of justice. We're going to Washington to say that if a man does not have a job or an income at that moment, you deprive him of life, you deprive him of liberty, and you deprive him of the pursuit of happiness. We're going to demand that America live up to her promise. We're organizing all over, and as I said, we aren't going begging. We are going to demand justice, and that's one of the things. Oftentimes, when we read the "I Have a Dream" speech, people typically read that, but they don't recognize that that's actually the last part of the speech. There's a whole speech that he gave prior to that, where he starts out saying essentially these same words. He said that we are coming here to collect a check because essentially America has been distributing cash or has been distributing checks that are now being bounced. So that again speaks to what he was saying, that we're not going there, we're not begging for anything, we're going there and we're demanding what's fully due to us. So I think it's important to think about that as well in terms of marginalization, again, the psychological pieces of it, where it forces people into these states of believing that what they have is what they deserve, as well as the people who have what they have often then believe that that's what they deserve and that other people do not deserve those things as well. Again, it's the psychological pieces of it that really force a lot of people or get people into a lot of places where they can't really understand other people's plights because they have this belief that just things are what they are and that people have what they deserve and other people don't deserve those things. So are there any forms of marginalization outside of the economic and the racial pieces within our society that we can identify today that folks don't believe are getting enough attention? Being able to tie in Dr. King's works. No one? It's all right. I'm camera shy too sometimes. All right, we'll just move on. All right, so Dr. King also talks about power. So one of my favorite works of his is the letter from Birmingham jail. So, and I also referenced this inside of my dissertation as well. But the letter from Birmingham jail, he and a group of other folks have been arrested for a peaceful protest, is what we call it now, but it was civil disobedience that was taking place. And there was a group of, I believe, 8 ministers that essentially were critical of Dr. King and his efforts. So even though it was civil disobedience, and it wasn't them going out destroying property or anything like that, what they had a problem with were the tactics that were being deployed by Dr. King. And essentially it's this, well, the section that I put it in is the aversive racism piece of it, which is this idea that a lot of folks don't actually have a lot of close contact with the people, the very people that they are critiquing. That's one of the problems with it. The other piece of it is that those same people typically always have an idea of what you should be doing versus them being the ones actually engaged on the front lines with you to transform those conditions as well. But one of the things that Dr. King said inside of this letter that was never sent, but it was published, was that an unjust law is a code that a numerical or a power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. So one of my favorite definitions of or understandings of justice in and of itself comes from Rainer Forst, who's a German philosopher. But essentially what he does is that he breaks down justice into two folds. So one, there has to be reasons, and then the reasons must be reciprocal. So being able to understand if we are advocating for one thing to take place, what are the reasons for this that we are advocating for? And then two, is it reciprocal? So essentially, are the conditions that we're putting these people on the same conditions that we would accept for ourselves? If not, then that is unjust. And that is what Dr. King is saying here himself. What he was really doing, in a way, was calling those ministers to ask themselves, if you were in a similar position, would you be doing the same things would you be doing the same things that you are asking us to do? Or would you essentially be out here on the front lines engaging in civil disobedience as well? And I think that's important to understand because oftentimes that's what people are not thinking about. It's being able to look at someone else's plight, something that you have no connection to or no relation to directly, in terms of you're not being physically or mentally, emotionally, economically harmed by something, but then being able to call into and then say that this is how you should be rectifying this particular situation. So what he's saying is that, again, these situations are unjust because it's a situation that you yourself would not accept for yourself. So then why are we willing to accept it then for someone else? The World House, 1967. This was actually his final manuscript, but this was a chapter that came from that book. Where do we go from here? What he says is that we have, and of course, it's also important to recognize, I'm putting the dates inside or the years inside of these titles purposely, because oftentimes people look at the earlier writings of Dr. King and how he advocated so much for nonviolence and different things like that. And that's not to say that once he got to the latter years of his life that he wasn't as much of an advocate for nonviolent, nonviolence, but he was definitely a lot more critical of structures toward the latter years of his life. And you can start to see these as you start to see the later writings that he had, or some of the speeches that he also gave. But this is, of course, just like not too long before he was assassinated or murdered. But he said that we have ancient habits to deal with, vast structures of power, indescribably complicated problems to solve. But unless we abdicate our humanity altogether and succumb to fear and impotence in the presence of the weapons we have ourselves created, it is as possible and as urgent to put an end to war and violence between nations as it is to put an end to poverty and racial injustice. So essentially what he's saying is that this is a collective problem that we all have to engage in together. And if it's a collective problem, then what we have to do is set aside power in certain areas in terms of not elevating ourselves over others. The other piece of that is recognizing the privilege that folks do have to change some of these systems in and of themselves. So if you have the power to change a law, to change a policy or something like that, then of course we want you to use that power for the right thing. But the other thing is that on a general level, we all should be working together to make sure that we're moving together as best as we possibly can. It goes back to, again, that whole idea that we must be born again in order to begin again. The Middle East question, which was the Southern Conference Leadership Conference that took place in Chicago, which of course he oversaw. But he states that in our society, it is murder psychologically to deprive a man of a job or an income. You are in substance saying that that man has no right to exist. You're in a real way depriving his life, liberty, in pursuit of happiness and denying his case to the very creed of society. So again, I'm pointing that out because again, it speaks to the powerless state that we are putting folks in. Now, of course, some of the authors that we have today, such as Ibram X. Kendi, he talks about this a lot inside of his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is that sometimes that idea of the psychological pieces, or sometimes the identifying of the physical state of powerlessness can be counterproductive, because what it does is that it doesn't often take into consideration the mental state as well, which is what I just spoke about not too long ago, which is understanding that it's one thing to understand where your place is in society physically or from a social standpoint, but to also recognize that mentally that doesn't have to be the end of your life as well. Dr. King on cultural imperialism. I do not know how to pronounce this person's name. Jawaharlal Nehru, I believe that's how you pronounce it. So it was a leader in the long anti-colonial struggle. So Dr. King wrote a tribute to this leader after his passing back in 1965. But what he states is that the peculiar genius of imperialism was found in its capacity to declude so much of the world into the belief that it was civilizing primitive cultures, even though it was grossly exploiting them. The very nature of slavery, or chattel slavery in and of itself, was that it was used as this Christian tool to civilize African peoples by bringing them over to America, and then of course doing everything that America did to African peoples that were enslaved or forced into labor. It was justified through it was justified through Christianity. So again, cultural imperialism, excuse me, is the inability to display one's capacity to their fullest potential, the lack of decision-making power, exposure to disrespectful treatment due to their position, which means that we're looking at these systems that are in place that are subjecting human beings to that position, which is, again, a dehumanizing act. So he stated in Let My People Go in 1965 that for the American Negro, there is a special relationship with Africa. It is the land of his origin. It was despoiled by invaders. Its culture was arrested and concealed to justify white supremacy. The American Negro's ancestors were not only driven into slavery, but their links with their past were severed so that their servitude might be psychological as well as physical. So again, it's the same thing that we talk about here within our society, and I gave some of those examples earlier. But you know, cultural imperialism is one thing that is essentially America in particular has practiced since the beginning of time and continues to do in different ways now, even if it doesn't look as harsh. One of the things that I often think of is the naturalization stuff that we do with how we naturalize new citizens to America, and the creed that we essentially make them recite, and how they're essentially pledging in a different way, their allegiance to America in and of itself. So there's different ways that we certainly do these things, even if it doesn't look as harsh as it was back when we were forcing human beings onto slave ships and then bringing them over to the Caribbeans and then the Americas. And then the violence of desperate men, 1958. Sorry, I don't know why. Sorry, don't mind that. All right, so the violence of desperate men in 1958, excerpt from Strive Toward Freedom. But these men were merely the children of their culture. So one of the reasons why I pulled this out is because Dr. King not only wants us to understand, or he didn't want to just understand the people who were having their cultures imposed on, or their very beings imposed on, but also understanding the people who were doing that. So he took the time to self-reflect on himself and understand the people that he was currently dealing with and where they were coming from and why they were doing the things that they were doing. And one of the things that he said is that these men are merely the children of their culture. When they seek to preserve segregation, they are seeking to preserve only what their local folkways have taught them was right. And that's not to say that they were right in doing the things that they were doing, but part of that and being able to break the cycle is being able to understand the cycle in which you are in. That's why we see so many folks now that are engaging in anti-racist work. One of the first steps that we ask folks to do is to self-reflect on yourself, your position, who you are, and how you are either perpetuating injustice within societies or how you are working to actively dismantle those systems as well. And that's a never-ending process. We should always be in the process of being able to reflect on those things and never become complacent with where we are and in our understandings of those situations. I forgot to put that last piece onto the slide in and of itself. Well, now I promise we're coming to the end of it. So, ways that Dr. King helps us to understand how to achieve peace within society. One is through love. So he reminds us that love is philia. It's unconditional. So when we talk about loving our neighbors as ourselves, being able to love another human being, because we don't expect anything from other folks except the basic piece, which is to be loved as well and to be respected as human beings as well. But outside of that, not expecting anything in particular, in response to our love that we're giving to other folks. So he presses a lot for philia love, again, the unconditional pieces of it. He also states that another reason why we must love our enemies is that hate scars the soul and distorts the personality. Mindful that hate is an evil and dangerous force, we too often think of what it does to the person hated. But essentially what he's saying is that we don't often think about what it's doing to the person who is hating. And again, I take this back to Pedagogy of the Oppressed with Paulo Freire. That's one of the things that he states is that in oppressive societies, everyone is essentially oppressed because we don't often recognize the ways in which we are oppressing other folks as much as we are recognizing the ways that we are being oppressed too. Even folks who are oppressing other individuals are typically doing so under the guise of some type of outside pressure, whether or not it's, like if I have a supervisor and he's telling me to do one thing or whatever, and I recognize that that's putting the students that I work with in a pretty unfavorable position, then again, that's a situation in which I am not only being oppressed as well, but I'm oppressing other folks because some other individual is now putting me in a position to do that as well. So it's being able to also recognize some of those external factors that are contributing to the reproduction of oppression as well. And then again, beginning again is the first piece with that. So one, and I didn't put the particular quote that he said in here, but one of the things that he stated with is that in order to love, then we must get to a place in which we learn to forgive. And I'm going to take this a little bit away from like Dr. King's work, from a personal, from a pastor that I heard probably about 15 years ago. But one of the things that he stated is that, there's 5 ways in which we are loved by God. And really the only one that I remember of those 5, which I feel pretty bad about, is that he stated that God doesn't remember. And I don't think that what Dr. King is saying is that we should forget just forget that these things ever happened. But I think what he was saying is that we have to learn to forgive in order to love people authentically and genuinely. Now, of course, that goes back to the reciprocity piece of that as well. So as members of communities that have largely oppressed others, I'm going to take race outside of it. But as a person who identifies as a heterosexual man, recognizing that patriarchy is gross within our society and that women are often exploited to high levels and high degrees that have placed them into some very, very, to say the least, unfavorable positions within our society, I have to acknowledge that I'm a part of, by birth, a system that does that. So it's not being able to take it personally and then say that I'm the person who's actually doing that, but I have a responsibility of, one, being able to forgive myself in a way, for being a part of the community that does that, but then taking the steps to then begin again with people who also identify within that community. And not just women as well, but folks who are also members of the LGBTQA community as well. So being able to begin again is a huge, huge piece of that. He states that peace is also achieved through civil disobedience. If you see all of his works, if you see all of the efforts that he does, everything is always, the conferences and all of that, it's typically surrounded by some type of either civil disobedience that's about to take place or that is currently being organized. So if you read his work, you know that civil disobedience is a huge, huge, huge component of that, which actually is a huge critical piece, literally, of peace in and of itself. So peace is achieved through direct actions such as civil disobedience, public, nonviolent, and conscientious, planned and intentional breach of law with the aim of changing laws or policies. So these are individuals that are tactfully engaging in efforts to, 1, bring awareness to the injustice, and then 2, bring change to the injustice in and of itself, even if it comes in the face of going to jail for said act. So one of the things now I kind of get in my feelings, if you will, about it, because we typically say things like non-peaceful or peaceful, non-peaceful, and different things like that. Typically, that really takes away from what is ultimately the issue at hand, which is the issue. So oftentimes we focus so much on the methods that folks are engaging in and not bringing enough attention to what the actual cause of the conversation is. So essentially what Dr. King advocates a lot for, which is civil disobedience. He takes the nonviolent approach with all of that, advocated for that throughout the bulk of his efforts, although toward the latter end of his days, he became definitely more sympathetic to folks who were engaging in not necessarily nonviolent approaches. And it's also important to recognize that it's not that he said that, you can't engage in violence whatsoever. There are a couple of different excerpts in which he actually sympathizes with folks who engage in violence. But what he says is that violence should never be engaged for the sake of inflicting violence or inflicting harm, physical harm on someone else. So it's not the intentional piece of it. Really what he's saying is that everybody should have the right to protect oneself if you are in a position in which your very well-being may be threatened. It's the act of intentionally inflicting harm on someone. That is where he disagreed. And I think that's one of the things that's a huge misconception with his work as well. And then the last piece is that peace is void of oppression in and of itself. So it goes back to these 5 faces of oppression. So peace cannot be bought. Peace is experienced in solidarity and loving acts, which cannot be incarnated in oppression. And I think that that sums up the life of Dr. King in and of itself. He was all about love. He was all about dialogue. He was all about civil disobedience for the sake of transforming not just systems that were racially oppressing people, but also economically exploiting people and pushing human beings on the outside of society as well. So again, we cannot have peace, and we will not see peace in a society that has exploitation continuing to go on, marginalization continuing to go on, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, or violence. So again, it brings forth the argument of no justice, no peace, and it really actually puts a different face on it. Typically, what people think of when you say no justice, no peace, is that they're thinking about the violent pieces of it, or the reaction to it. So if this court case doesn't come out the way that we intend to, then we're going to be inflicting violence on to other folks. That's what people hear when they hear no justice, no peace. But essentially, when you take it at its true definition, philosophically, if there's no justice within our society, then there is no peace. And that's within our court systems, that's within our educational systems, that's within our political systems, health systems. If there's no justice, then there really is no peace, because you still have people that are being exploited, marginalized, being empowered, disempowered, and suffering through violence and cultural imperialism. So I'll end it with this last quote from Dr. King in and of itself. But he says that, so we must see that peace represents a sweeter music, a cosmic melody that is far superior to the discords of war. Somehow we must transform the dynamics of the world power struggle from the nuclear arms race, which no one can win, to a creative contest to harness man's genius for the purpose of making peace and prosperity a reality for all the nations of the world. In short, we must shift the arms race into a peace race. If we have the will and the determination to mount such a peace offensive, we will unlock hitherto tightly sealed doors of hope and bring new light into the dark chambers of pessimism. So I love this quote largely because I don't take it at I know he was talking about, nuclear arms and all the other stuff, but I think that there's other ways that we engage in the nuclear arms race within our societies. There's different ways that in which that looks like. But what he's saying here is that if we're truly going to begin again, then we have to engage in peace efforts. And what that looks like is how we are engaging in dialogue, how we are reflecting on the current status of our societies, our social structures, our systems that are in place, and then how are we actively engaging in the efforts to transform those spaces as well. So that was it. That's all I had to present on here today. Does anyone have any lingering questions about any of that? Or any thoughts? Where was I off?
Hey, Quatez, I have a question for you.
Yes.
You mentioned something in the beginning of your presentation when you were talking about the different faces of oppression. And at one point, you talked about imperialism. And I know all of us are involved in preparing students for how to be successful in the workplace once they leave Wright State. How can we prepare them in such a way where we're not promoting imperialism? Because I think of how I teach my student workers how to dress at work, how to respond to emails, the attitudes they have in meetings. And I'm wondering, the reason why I'm teaching them that is because what I've seen, that is how majority culture has been able to be successful. And there are things that people didn't teach me as a Cuban girl from Miami. So I just would love to get your thoughts on how to promote the success without promoting the imperialism.
Yeah, so I think it's okay to talk about what's accepted in different workplaces. So I recognize that I work at Wright State University, so I don't set the dress code. So I recognize things like that. I think where the problem comes in is when we associate these derogatory concepts or ideas behind people who don't fall in line with that. So as somebody who, I have 2 tattoos, but then we see in society and it's more acceptable now in society for folks to have tattoos. But when I was younger, man, it was like if you had a tattoo, then you were like a gangbanger. You were going to prison for sure, and different things like that. So I don't necessarily think it's it's bad to talk about, what's acceptable in a space and what's expected of folks within those spaces. I think where it gets bad is when we talk about the negative associations with folks who don't typically like fall in line with that. Because of course, then if we have these ideas about people who fall into that category, then we treat them as such. Does anyone else have any thoughts about that? I think that's a really great question.
Erin has her hand up.
Yeah, I see it. Thank you.
You ready for my comment?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay. Just to circle back to the concept of beginning again, which kind of touches on rebirth or being reborn, you made me think of not so much President Biden's speech, but the comment he gave after that said basically, we have to acknowledge what happened before we can move past it, which you and I have had conversations about people who want to deny that there's a race problem in our country, the whole nice racism idea. But I think that's a huge hurdle. And we're making tiny little progressive steps on the way, but the concept of reparations requires acknowledgement, requires saying, yeah, we did this. Yes, we exploited this group of people, that group of people. We want to move forward. And I just sometimes wonder if we're ever going to get to that point. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but you just kind of made me think of the whole address the other day of the insurrection last year, and acknowledgement is a big piece of all of this. Owning your part. So that's it. Nicely done.
Yeah. So are you saying what are my thoughts on if reparations will?
Not so much that, because I know that's a huge
Mm,
conversation, but just the simple idea that in order to begin again, in order to leave what's there behind, you have to acknowledge what's there first. And there's just so many barriers to that. I know so many people that think, well, because slavery stopped in the traditional definition of the word, then racism doesn't exist anymore. And you and I know that's not true. But
yeah.
I think a lot of people who are not directly impacted by it just want to keep those blinders on and live their happy, comfortable life. And it is uncomfortable.
Man, so I'm glad that Dr. D'Agostino isn't here right now because I'm going to butcher this with Paulo Freire. So Paulo Freire, of course, as I was talking about, so he was a critical theorist, but he developed, the idea of critical consciousness, and he has this. I wouldn't call it like a continuum, but essentially, like there are these stages to critical consciousness, and you have like the fanaticized. And fanaticized people are the ones that just don't believe that the injustices that are going on are the result of anything that was intentional. A lot of these things, like it just is kind of like what they're in pure denial about some of these things. And then you have folks that they're aware that certain things are existing or whatever, but it's not as bad as like what people are kind of like making it out to be. All of that to say is that you have folks that I look at reflection as really this dichotomy between reflection and then critical reflection. Some people do possess the capacity to acknowledge that, man, the world could definitely be much better, but then they don't take the critical steps of being able to locate why certain things are the way that they are. They don't take the steps to continue learning themselves about what is reproducing some of these systems, become critical of even the efforts that are taking place to bring attention to some of these issues. Even now, even before the 1619 Project was released, when it was just the essays in and of itself, people were having issues with the fact that it was out, or that people have these ideas about how America started and what the principles were, but not taking into consideration, what the founding fathers were intent on doing, or, like not factoring in, Christianity in and of itself and what was going, all these other different things. So all that to say that I think some people are able to reflect and they're able to identify, yeah, certain things are bad, but what they're not able to do is take the critical steps of being able to understand why things are as bad as they are. But then the other critical piece of it, which is, what am I doing to also perpetuate that as well? Like, how am I contributing to these issues that are going on? And that's the critical piece, because it's critical, because if you don't do that for yourself, then you're only going to continue to reproduce the systems that are in place as they are. So I think that's a great comment in and of itself. It's not necessarily, again, just getting people to recognize that these inequities exist, but reflecting on how and how we are reproducing them as well.
Agree.
Any more questions? One more question. My committee member.
I'm sitting here like I have a lot of thoughts. I know they're kind of digital. I was just like making notes like as you were talking, but I'm just trying to think about because I know the both of us, like you and I, we teach or we have taught like African American history classes, and for me, one of the biggest takeaways is that when if what students know about Dr. King,
Hmm.
and if they do, how baseline it is, right? It's the second half of the speech that you talked about. You're like, we'll talk about the first 99% of remember, towards the end, right? The things that are more palatable that are if you make a paragraph or two in the history text. So I'm just wondering, like, how do we translate, like, in a society that I think by and large, like, Dr. King had the backing of what I think the Black church, like big, capitalized, B and C that existed, and it was like the foundation. You pointed to some of the organizations that he was a part of and led, right? So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So you at least had a group of people who were taking the leadership in that regard that I think doesn't exist here in 2022 the way that it did back when King was, very active before he was assassinated. So when we have challenges, like so the things that could have us think deeper into Dr. King and like to have these concepts like supersede even the religious piece of, because you get into like, oh, the religion part of it, like public institutions, like secular versus, so there's so many things and holes that can be, pointed into like if you're going to align with his philosophy or not. But at the end of the day, we know where he was working towards. But I'm just wondering where you think if today, like if being a part of this, I think national kind of resistance to this critical race theory thought, right? So I think the things that could have us learn more about Dr. King and the things and the ideals that he stood for and how it could potentially influence society today. Maybe your stance, or what do you think his stance would be with the rub with that? So like, even though I know your conversation wasn't on CRT, but I think in order to get to where we can have more conversations like we had today about, like you prepared about Dr. King, that's going to take an element of people understanding that concept differently. So just what are your thoughts? Like I'm just kind of thinking out loud when I took notes, but I'm wondering, for me, the rub of CRT and the argument that is misunderstood today as being an inhibitor to moving forward with learning more about him more deeply.
Yeah, so I think, well, one CRT, well, one for those of us, I mean, for folks who don't know as much about critical race theory in and of itself, um, what it's essentially used to do, I'm just going to make it as succinct as possible, is that we're looking at the living conditions of largely like people of color and how these living conditions have come to be. And that's largely the work of Dr. King. Like a lot of it was transforming and bringing awareness to the exploitation of not only racialized people, but economically disadvantaged Black people and white people as well. So being able to call attention then to the systems that are in place. I think he would be very, very, very critical of the fact that we have institutions and structures that are moving away from being able to do this, because what you're now doing is putting people again in these powerless states to even be able to develop their capacity to understand the systems that are in place as they are in place and how they are disadvantaging people of color as well as economically disadvantaged people as well. And of course, CRT now takes into consideration is very intersectional. So now you take in to consideration gender. You also take into consideration sexuality, all these other different concepts. So I think that he would be very critical of that, as I am as well, because what happens is that there are, and I think I've talked to you about this before, Katwana, with the work that I've been, these other anti or racial equity centers that exist in higher education. There's one that I wish I was able to study, which is at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, but they have a component of it in which they focus specifically with young people. They do that intentionally because they recognize it's kind of like start them young. So in order to transform our societies and our spaces, we have to start reaching out and reaching back to young people and getting them in positions of being able to identify these systems as they are in place and how they are creating these inequities and disadvantaging certain categories of people. Now, when we're taking these concepts out of schools or we're aiming to do that, now you're stripping students of the capacity to be able to do that. Which is then going to, in turn, long term, going to reproduce a lot of those things that were in place. It goes back to what Dr. King said on the slide. Being able to reflect on why, these white men were producing these systems is because they were growing up in these systems and being handed the keys to the car, not knowing that there were a lot of faulty things about it, a lot of faulty things about that vehicle. Even though it was going to get them to where they needed to go, it was still, producing these inequitable systems. So, again, to your question, I think I was answering your question, but yeah, I think part of it is, recognizing that if we take if we take anti-racism, if we take critical race theory, if we take these critical theories in and of themselves out of schools that are investigating these inequities as they exist, we're really crippling and disadvantaging our young people from developing their capacity, at least in a schooling setting, from being able to understand what's going on. A lot of people have issues and different things with Dave Chappelle himself. But one thing Dave Chappelle said is that people think that I get up on the microphone and I just start talking or whatever. But what they fail to recognize is that my mom has her PhD basically in African American history. So I'm in Wright State's Bolinga Black Cultural Resources Center, where his mom literally was the first director of the center. So you have some students, you have some kids that can grow up in homes, and that are growing up now in homes where their parents are very active, socially, politically, different things like that, and they're having those conversations, but that's not the norm of every kid. So you have some students that will grow up and they'll be equipped with those tool sets, whether or not it's through the school systems, as they currently are still teaching some of those ideas, or not, because we're not even teaching CRT in schools. So that's not even in and of itself. But as we're talking about what they deem to be divisive concepts, that's what the Ohio bill talks about, is that when we're talking about slavery and different things like that, these are divisive concepts. So whether or not, as we currently are, if we stop talking about these divisive concepts at some point in time, then again, you're going to have a lot of students that are going to, what Eddie Glaude talks about is like this misremembering or misremembering. Right now, we're misremembering our history because it's been told so many different times and it's been mistold so many times. Now we're just not even going to remember because we won't even know our history in and of itself. So I think those are some of the issues that are facing a lot of our young people and our school systems in general.
Thank you.
I don't know if I answered your question. I started going on there for a little bit.
I don't know that I asked the direct one, so you're fine. Just kind of thinking out loud, yeah.
Critical reflection, Yes. Any other questions for anyone? Mr. Art Brooks, nothing from you? All right. Well, thank you all for joining us here today. For those of you who are a part of the Wright State community, we do have one more event that's going to be taking place virtually. That takes place Monday, January 17th, from 7 to 9 p.m. That's going to be our annual MLK Day celebration. Again, takes place from 7 to 9. We have the great Pastor Renard Allen, who's going to be delivering the keynote address, as well as some campus speakers as well. So if you can be there, we'd love for you to be there. You can visit the Bolinga website. I'm going to make sure that the actual link is up to date. But it's going to be completely virtual again, so that we can stop the spread of the COVID virus. But all in all, thank you all for joining me today. Peace literally be with all of you so that it can be with me. and have a good one.
Thank you, Quatez. Excellent presentation.